So I want you to imagine for a second that you're living in a house, but over time you start noticing that the foundation is cracked.
Yeah, or the roof is leaking.
Right. The walls just feel like they're closing in on you. So you decide the only logical thing to do is to just tear it down. You spend years carefully dismantling this house, brick by brick, pulling up the floorboards, tearing down the drywall.
And that right there is what we call the deconstruction phase.
Exactly, that's deconstruction. But here's the catch. Once the house is entirely gone, you're just left standing there in an empty field.
You're in this absolute meaning vacuum.
Yes, a meaning vacuum. The sun is going down and you still need a place to live. And that empty field, that deep need for shelter is exactly where an entire generation finds themselves today when it comes to faith.
It's a profound state of spiritual homelessness, really. I mean, the architectural flaws of the old house, they've been identified and removed.
Yeah.
But the fundamental human need for structure, for a coherent narrative about meaning and community, that hasn't disappeared just because the walls came down.
So welcome to the deep dive. Our source material today is this really comprehensive research briefing that maps out Gen Z's faith journey, moving from that deconstruction phase into what the researchers are actually calling reconstruction.
Which is a fascinating pivot.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because the prevailing cultural narrative out there tells you that this generation is entirely post-Christian, that they've simply walked away from the concept of faith and just, locked the door behind them.
Yeah, that's the headline you always see.
But the data we're looking at today paints a vastly more complex and, frankly, a pretty surprising picture. So, okay, let's unpack this. If we want to understand what kind of shelter they're trying to build in that empty field, we need to take a hard look at the specific bricks they decided to throw away.
Yeah, and the demographic numbers tell a really fascinating story about what exactly was discarded. If you look at explicit secularism, atheism among Gen Z sits at about 13%.
Which is, that's double the general adult population, right?
Exactly, it's double.
Yeah.
So, looking at that single metric in a vacuum, you might conclude that the prevailing narrative is right. They're all just leaving. But the research points to a much larger segment. 34% of Gen Z falls into the category of spiritual knowns.
Spiritual knowns. Okay, let's break down that term because spiritual knowns sounds like people who have just entirely opted out of belief.
It's actually the exact opposite. A spiritual none is basically a sociological term for someone who claims absolutely no specific religious affiliation like a census or a survey.
Okay.
But a significant majority of this group explicitly expresses a belief in a higher power or a spiritual reality.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they aren't rejecting the divine. What they are rejecting, firmly and decisively, is what the researchers call hype culture.
Hype culture. Okay, so I'm picturing the mega church model, the concert-grade lighting, the fog machines, the massive sound systems. It's exactly. For decades, the prevailing strategy in youth ministry was essentially entertainment. It was high-energy, highly polished communicators, an aesthetic that really mirrored a pop concert or a corporate product launch. Right. Because the underlying logic was that you needed to compete with mainstream media for their attention.
Precisely. But here's the thing about this generation. They have been relentlessly marketed to on screens since the literal day they were born.
Yeah, they see right through it.
Their radar for a sales pitch is hypersensitive. So when they look at a highly produced religious service, they don't see authentic community, they see a marketing campaign.
They view it as an attempt to sell them an experiential product.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you've been swimming in targeted ads your whole life, any environment that feels curated is going to instantly trigger a defense mechanism. But the briefing mentions that this rejection sort of reached a boiling point recently. The peak of this internet deconstruction happened heavily between 2020 and 2024. Why did it accelerate so drastically in that specific window?
Well, it was a perfect storm of sociology and technology. So during the pandemic, physical isolation forced almost all human interaction onto algorithmic platforms.
Right, everyone was just stuck at home on their phones.
And those algorithms are designed to measure watch time. And do you know what emotion holds human attention the longest?
Let me guess. Outrage.
Outrage, exactly.
No.
So stories of religious trauma, institutional hypocrisy, intense political polarization within faith communities, All of that was artificially boosted to the top of everyone's feeds.
Wow. So the algorithm effectively gamified the deconstruction of institutional faith because tearing down the establishment just generated massive engagement metrics.
It did. It was highly incentivized by the platforms themselves.
So the internet essentially helped burn down the house. But now we're in this reconstruction phase. They are sitting in the meaning vacuum. If the algorithm thrives on modern culture wars and outrage, where do you go to build something new?
The data points to a massive pivot backward, like really far backward. They're actively looking for historical roots that completely predate the modern cultural and political landscape.
Interesting.
Yeah, we're seeing a staggering resurgence of interest in early church history and what we call classical liturgy.
Okay, I want to pause there because classical liturgy isn't really a term everyone uses every day. What does that actually look like in practice for, say, a 20-year-old?
Sure. So liturgy refers to ancient, highly structured rhythms of worship. So instead of a charismatic speaker giving a spontaneous, emotionally driven 40-minute lecture, a liturgical service relies on communal participation.
Okay, like what?
It's call and response readings, reciting historical creeds that are literally thousands of years old, partaking in communion, observing silent prayer. It's remarkably unhurried.
Unhurried, I like that word.
Yeah, and the aesthetic is often just natural light or a single candle as opposed to, a laser light show.
Which perfectly lines up with what the research briefing highlights about those spontaneous student-led prayer gatherings, like the Asbury Awakening a few years ago. Tens of thousands of young people showed up.
Right, out of nowhere.
And the defining characteristic wasn't who was speaking, but the absolute lack of production. There were no celebrity speakers, no professional worship bands, no screens with lyrics, just acoustic instruments, open confession, and just long hours of quiet.
And that aesthetic shift is crucial. It proves the appetite isn't for a better show, it's for a deeper anchor.
But wait, I have to challenge this based on another data point in our source material. The briefing states that over 80% of Gen Z trusts a single individual over an organization. Like, they possess profound, deep-seated institutional trust issues.
Very true.
So classical liturgy and ancient church history are inherently tied to massive historical institutions. How do you integrate a generation that is deeply skeptical of institutions into a thousands-of-year-old institutional tradition? Doesn't that just immediately trigger their alarms?
What's fascinating here is the changing mechanism of how authority is actually granted. For previous generations, authority was inherently tied to a title or an institution.
Like the pastor or the CEO?
Right. The pastor, the professor, the CEO had authority simply by virtue of holding the office. The institution legitimized the person. But for Gen Z, authority is granted almost exclusively through personal vulnerability.
Huh. So the title means nothing without transparency.
Exactly. The title might even be a liability if it isn't accompanied by transparency. They want the solid anchor of historical tradition because something that has survived for millennia feels safe. But the gateway to that anchor is purely relational.
So they won't just blindly follow the institution.
No, a young person won't walk into a cathedral just because the cathedral has historical authority. They will explore the liturgy if and only if an individual they trust.
Someone who has been open with them.
Yeah, someone who has been honest about their own brokenness, their doubts, their struggles, if that person invites them into it. The vulnerable person legitimizes the institution, not the other way around.
That is a massive paradigm shift in how trust is brokered. But, that raises a really complicated logistical question. If trust is purely relational and young people are overwhelmingly skeptical of stepping foot inside heavily produced mega churches to meet these people, where are they actually encountering these vulnerable guides? Where are they finding the gateway to ancient traditions?
Ironically, they're finding these ancient analog traditions in the most hyper-digital environment possible, on their screens.
Wow.
The digital landscape has fundamentally replaced the local physical sanctuary as the primary point of spiritual discovery.
Let's follow that thread because the briefing spends a lot of time on this tension between digital discipleship and local community. I mean, we tend to think of platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube as pure entertainment vectors.
Right, viral trends, cooking hacks.
Yeah, comedy sketches, whatever. But the research shows these platforms have mutated into massive theological classrooms.
The scale of this digital education is just unprecedented. You have digital creators breaking down complex systematic theology for millions of viewers.
Okay, let's define systematic theology real quick so we're all on the same page.
Sure. Systematic theology is the deeply academic practice of taking vast philosophical concepts about existence, like the nature of God, the origin of evil, the mechanics of human free will.
Light reading.
Yeah, exactly, and organizing them into a comprehensive, rational system.
Historically, this is material you would study over 4 years in a seminary, reading massive multi-volume textbooks.
And the paradox here is just wild. These creators are attempting to teach those massive, multi-volume seminary concepts in under 60 seconds.
Yeah.
They are using highly specific visual aesthetics, hyperfast editing, and bite-sized micro-lectures. I mean, you are using a dopamine-spiking, algorithmically driven video format to teach a generation about ancient, unhurried monastic silence.
It's an incredible contrast.
It's like using a megaphone to teach someone how to whisper. How does that even work? Well, it works by democratization, which is really the great benefit of this era. It makes highly complex historical faith accessible to a young person sitting in their bedroom who might be, honestly, far too intimidated to ever walk through the physical doors of a church.
Right. It completely removes the barrier to entry.
It does. But, as you pointed out, the format itself is a profound contradiction to the message.
The medium is completely at odds with the message.
And that creates a very specific sociological tension. The digital ecosystem democratizes the information, sure, but it simultaneously strips away local pastoral accountability.
Because it's just you and your screen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When your spiritual community is algorithmic, you are engaging with isolated content, not a community that actually knows you, observes your behavior, or, helps you apply those truths to your real life.
Which naturally leads to tribalism, right? Because the algorithm doesn't care about your character development. It cares about retention.
The architecture of social media naturally rewards and amplifies edgy, controversial opinions over nuanced, long-term character development. I mean, nuance doesn't get shared. Hot takes get shared.
Yeah, nobody goes viral for being reasonable.
Exactly. So you end up with a highly tribalized theology. You can't disciple someone's emotional maturity in 60 seconds, but you can certainly radicalize their theological worldview.
And the real-world cost of that lack of local connection is devastating. The briefing gives us this staggering statistic. 73% of Gen Z report feeling alone sometimes or always.
It's heartbreaking.
Almost 3/4 of a generation is living with pervasive, chronic loneliness.
It is a documented mental health epidemic. Skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression are directly tied to the breakdown of face-to-face local communities. And the data shows that traditional religious cliches utterly fail to address the depth of this crisis.
What kind of cliches?
Like when a young person expresses severe clinical anxiety and they are met with a passing comment like, oh, just pray harder, or, give your anxiety to God. Yeah, it comes across as profoundly tone-deaf. It implies that their mental health struggle is simply a lack of faith, which is deeply damaging.
But this feels like a self-perpetuating cycle. I mean, if 73% feel isolated and their primary method of spiritual exploration is a 60-second video that strips away real-world accountability, how does the screen ever fix the anxiety?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because by staying on the platform to learn about theology, aren't they just feeding the exact same algorithm that is isolating them in the first place?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how Reconstruction is actually working, the most effective digital creators and spiritual leaders understand that exact trap. The goal of healthy digital discipleship, according to the research, cannot be to keep the user on the screen.
It has to point outward.
Right. The goal is to use the digital platform as a bridge to point the user toward analog local solutions.
So using the algorithm to engineer an exit from the algorithm?
Precisely. For instance, one of the ancient practices gaining the most traction right now is the concept of a Sabbath. But it is specifically translated for the modern era as a digital Sabbath.
Okay, so what does that entail?
This involves turning off the phone and completely disconnecting from the internet for 24 hours to actively combat modern anxiety.
Wow, 24 hours. That's huge for this demographic.
Right, so the digital video introduces the theological concept, it explains the historical precedent, but the physical application forces the viewer to re-engage with their physical reality, their local community, and honestly, their own quiet thoughts.
That deep need for genuine physical presence and relief from this crushing anxiety brings us to the ultimate clash outlined in our source material. It's the collision between the digital world this generation is forced to inhabit and the historical faith they're trying to reconstruct. And it centers entirely around how our society processes mistakes.
This is where sociology and theology directly intersect in the data. We have to look objectively at the digital landscape. Internet culture, by its very architecture, is inherently legalistic.
Yeah.
It operates on a system of intense, immediate judgment. When a mistake is made, the digital demand is immediate and permanent banishment.
Which we commonly call cancel culture. And the mechanism behind it is terrifying when you really look at it. I like to think of a digital cancellation as a blockchain of your absolute worst day.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a permanent, unchangeable, publicly accessible ledger of your biggest failure, and it's gamified for everyone else's entertainment.
And that permanent ledger creates a baseline of immense psychological anxiety. Now, Gen Z, to their credit, deeply champions social equity, justice, and holding powerful people accountable for their actions.
Right. They care a lot about accountability.
But the sociological tension highlighted in the briefing is that while this generation has developed a highly tuned mechanism for accountability, the digital space lacks any cultural mechanism for redemption, for restoration, or for forgiveness.
You are literally always one mistake away from total social exile.
Always.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we look at how they are reconstructing their faith, the core concept of historical Christianity, this idea of radical grace, is operating as the exact antithesis to that digital ledger.
Yes.
According to the source material, the appeal of grace is that it isn't a permanent digital tattoo of your worst moment. It's a regenerative process.
And the research briefing points out that this generation is turning to historical Christianity precisely because it offers something that digital legalism simply cannot.
Oh.
Uncompromising accountability matched with infinite grace.
Wow.
And the ultimate model they are drawn to is the historical Jesus, specifically how the texts portray him managing that exact balance.
How does the briefing frame that balance? Because usually accountability and grace feel like they're at complete opposite ends of the spectrum.
Well, the data suggests Gen Z is drawn to the historical Jesus because he exhibited extreme accountability. According to the texts, he ruthlessly called out the religious corruption and hypocrisy of the institutional leaders of his day. He didn't soften the truth to make the powerful comfortable.
The classic example being, flipping the tables in the temple.
Exactly. But he matched that extreme demand for justice with radical, scandalous inclusion.
Right.
He was known for eating meals with the social outcasts, the tax collectors, the people who had been effectively canceled by the religious and social elite of the first century.
Which is so relevant today.
For a generation exhausted by cancel culture, seeing a historical figure hold the line on truth while keeping an open door for restoration is deeply compelling.
That balance, truth without banishment, it provides an anchor for overcoming incredibly dark circumstances. We talked earlier about anxiety and how the cliche "just pray harder" is basically toxic positivity. It minimizes human suffering. But our source briefing points out that true historical faith addresses these circumstances through raw, unfiltered reality.
It doesn't hide from the pain.
Not at all. The briefing specifically mentions the Book of Songs.
Yes, the Psalms are a vital piece of this reconstruction.
For those who might not know, the Psalms are ancient Hebrew poetry. But what's fascinating is that almost a third of them are what scholars call Psalms of Lament.
Which are so powerful.
These are songs and prayers dedicated entirely to expressing deep sorrow, anger, feelings of abandonment, and absolute despair. They are literally people screaming at God.
And the inclusion of lament fundamentally shifts the narrative. It shows that dealing with intense anxiety or feeling completely lost isn't a spiritual failure. It is the baseline human condition.
That narrative of raw vulnerability is something that highly produced, heavily marketed environments often get completely wrong. When everything is polished, it projects a shiny perfection that Gen Z immediately clocks as fake.
Right. They see right through the shine.
The Psalms prove that you don't have to clean yourself up before you are allowed to participate in the spiritual community.
And that leads directly to how a reconstructed faith changes the handling of wrongdoing. If you live in a digital culture where every mistake is fatal, human nature dictates that you will hide your mistakes at all costs.
You will project perfection just to survive.
Exactly. But the briefing notes that if a young person truly adopts this historical concept of grace, it completely rewires the nature of repentance.
I mean, in our modern era, when a public figure messes up, the public apology is almost always a highly crafted PR stunt. It's legalistic damage control designed by crisis managers.
Yeah, it rarely feels authentic.
Never.
But for those embracing this reconstructed faith, relying on the concept of grace means public repentance looks radically different. It relies on vulnerability rather than performance.
Because they aren't afraid of the ledger anymore.
Right. The research suggests that this grace allows a person to overcome massive failures because their identity is no longer tied to projecting a perfect image to the digital crowd.
They can step out into the light.
They can own their absolute worst moments without excuse and trust that they are still fundamentally capable of being restored. That framework is the ultimate antidote to the anxiety of the digital ledger.
Whether you are part of Gen Z yourself, whether you are raising teenagers, or honestly, if you are just an adult trying to survive, the sheer toxicity of the modern internet, there is a profound universal lesson for you here. What we are seeing in this research isn't just a youth trend.
It's much bigger than that.
It is a fundamental reevaluation of what a community is supposed to be. They are no longer evaluating spiritual spaces as moral clearinghouses where you go to show off how put together you are.
Right.
They're seeking out communities as vital, life-saving solutions to severe isolation and digital exhaustion.
It is a profound shift from viewing the religious institution as a theater for entertainment to viewing the local community as a hospital for the exhausted.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've looked at how an entire generation is trading the fog machines and the marketing hype for the quiet reverence of ancient liturgy.
Yeah, that massive pivot backwards.
We've unpacked the highly contradictory mechanics of trying to learn deep systematic theology in 60-second bursts on TikTok, and the very real loneliness that algorithmic tribalism can mask.
The digital versus local tension?
Exactly. And we've explored this desperate sociological search for radical grace in a digital world that demands permanent banishment for every single mistake.
It truly is a quiet analog revival, being built right on top of the ruins of their deconstruction.
It is, and it leaves us with something really important to think about as we wrap up. If a generation that was raised entirely on instant digital gratification, dopamine hits, and fast-paced screens is suddenly craving ancient, unhurried silence and radical grace, what forgotten, unhurried practice from the past might be exactly what you need to reconstruct your own peace of mind today.